Dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, has rapidly grown as a visible diagnosis on social media.
In the United States, there are an estimated 4 million people diagnosed with
dissociative identity disorder.
What is it like to live with multiple people in one body?
d.i.d creators on YouTube have millions of subscribers. d.i.d videos on TikTok have a combined 5 billion views. And Google search traffic history shows a drastic bump in interest in this diagnosis in the past few years. All of this has put dissociative identity disorder back into the spotlight. And for mental health professionals like myself, this kind of popularity opens up controversies and questions that are hard to shake. Is d.i.d being overdiagnosed, or has it been chronically underdiagnosed? Perhaps there's some reason that it's only recently become more common? Is it just a trendy fad? How can you tell the difference between a real case and something else? What does the research say about it? Is it even a genuine mental health diagnosis? If it's too controversial, then should we consider eliminating the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder altogether? The only way to give a somewhat satisfying answer to all of this is to get into the weeds of the topic and look beyond just the trend, which is exactly what I intend on doing. So, stick around, because there's a lot to unpack. This video was sponsored by Nebula. Dissociative identity disorder, or d.i.d, is a mental health diagnosis that's often misunderstood and perceived as strange. And that strangeness captivates people's fascination. I mean, the idea of having multiple identities coexist within a single person makes for some great entertainment. That strangeness, though, also introduces some skepticism among the general public and mental health professionals alike. But we'll get to all that later on. If you'll humor me, before we go any further, I think that it's important to start by defining and understanding dissociative identity disorder as it exists as a medical diagnosis today. And to do that, we need to go to the source and look at the Mental Health Bible in America, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM for short. There are 5 different criteria for diagnosing d.i.d, and a person must meet all 5 in order to receive the diagnosis. They are as follows. First, a disruption of identity, characterized by 2 or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption in identity involves marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. Second, recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and/or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. Third, the symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Fourth, the disturbance is not a normal part of broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. Note, in children, the symptoms are not better explained by imaginary playmates or other fantasy play. And fifth, the symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, for example, blackouts or chaotic behavior during alcohol intoxication, or another medical condition, for example, complex partial seizures. So in layman's terms, there's a few things to note in these criteria. The first thing is that the diagnosis requires 2 or more personality states that are labeled as different identities. Now, this is different from having distinct personalities. In psychology, basically your personality is like the long-term vision of who you are. So it includes a very consistent set of traits and ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Personality states, on the other hand, are more like short-lived moods or behaviors that pop up in specific scenarios. So, for example, you might be loud, outgoing, and impulsive with your friends, but quiet, reserved, and organized at work. So while your personality, is the big picture of who you are, Personality states are just a snapshot of your current emotions and behaviors in a particular situation. So in dissociative identity disorder, the person only has one personality, not multiple personalities. But they might express different personality states and perceive them as separate identities. So I know that sounds kind of pedantic, but it is an important distinction. People with d.i.d. don't have multiple people living inside of them, just one personality that's been fragmented into these states or identities. Those fragmented states or identities are called alters because they have an altered way of thinking, behaving, and relating to the world. Alters are often given their own name and can vary in any dimension: age, gender, sexual orientation, temperament, even physical characteristics. In rare cases, some folks might describe one of their identities as an inanimate object, or an animal, or even a fictional character. They can have different memories, experience separate consciousness, can have different skills and abilities. For example, one identity might exclusively speak a second language that the person learned, while the others are unable. That said, most of the time, d.i.d. is not easily recognizable. Media may perpetuate this idea that alters are dramatically visible or wear different clothes or have a change in their voice, but most of the time, people with d.i.d. look and sound the same. Instead, the change in identity happens in terms of their opinions, memories, or demeanor. Some people with d.i.d. have more subtle identities, to the point that they're not even differentiated enough to give them names. Most people with d.i.d. are quite covert in their diagnosis, for example. I just don't want to give the wrong impression, and I think that that's a bit of a stereotype that gets thrown around. In any case, the first criteria also describes a loss of a sense of agency, which makes sense. When a person dissociates and changes identities, this is called switching. And when a particular identity is the one that's in control and that's actively engaging with the outside world, people with d.i.d. say that that identity is fronting. If you regularly feel as though you're ceding consciousness to another identity, yeah, you wouldn't feel in control. This first criteria also describes how alters interfere with a sense of self. In the d.i.d. world, the self we're talking about here is the person's core identity, which is usually their actual personality. Interestingly, the core identity can be different from the host, which is the identity that's most often present and interacting with the world, though they tend to be the same. The collection of alters is known as a system, and a person's system can have as few as 2 total identities, all the way up to 100, or in some very extreme cases, some claim thousands. However, the average number of alters seems to hover around 10 to 15. The second criteria identifies a prevalent symptom of dissociative identity disorder, which is essentially amnesia. People with d.i.d. often describe having gaps in memory about everyday events, or forgetting who they are, what their name is, where they live, who they're in a relationship with, or they might find objects in their possession that they don't recall buying, or have strangers come up to them and say that they met them and call them a name that isn't theirs. Or they might appear suddenly in a new location without knowing how they got there. Scary stuff. This amnesia can also block memories of impactful moments from their past, or it might cause someone to forget well-rehearsed skills like how to drive or how to do their job. The underlying cause of this amnesia is commonly attributed to another identity or alter fronting. That said, it's important to note that not everyone with d.i.d. experiences amnesia in the same way or to the same degree. Some folks have different levels of awareness of their alters. Some might be co-conscious and have full knowledge of the actions of another alter, while others have apparent total separation of consciousness and memories. Even within a system, there can be varying levels of amnesia depending on which alter is fronting. The last 3 criteria are pretty straightforward. d.i.d. is a disorder, so if a person experiences multiple identities, but it doesn't cause them distress, and it doesn't negatively affect their life in any significant way, then they don't have d.i.d. Likewise, if the embodiment of another identity is part of an accepted cultural or religious practice, then it's not d.i.d. So a medium at a seance who embodies the spirit of someone who's died does not have d.i.d. Or someone who gets possessed by the Holy Spirit and starts speaking in tongues at a church where this happens a lot does not have d.i.d. And a child who acts out different roles of their imaginary friends does not have d.i.d. Likewise, someone who has these symptoms as a result of using substances or some other medical diagnosis does not have d.i.d. So those are the diagnostic criteria of dissociative identity disorder, which gives some good insights, but it only gives a partial glimpse into what it's actually like to live with d.i.d. And for that, I'll refer you down in the description. I've got my list of sources in a Google Doc, and I'll list some YouTube videos of people who discuss their firsthand experiences there if you want to learn more. In terms of demographic patterns, though, generally speaking, d.i.d. tends to manifest more frequently in women during their late 20s and early 30s. But if you dig into their childhood, you usually uncover dissociative symptoms starting between the ages of 5 and 10, with different identities emerging as early as age 6. Those diagnosed with d.i.d. often experience other chronic symptoms that are definitely not listed in the diagnosis, such as depersonalization and derealization, mood swings, headaches, sleep disturbances, auditory hallucinations, self-harm, and suicidal ideation and attempts, among others. The exact cause of d.i.d. is the beginning of the controversy. You see, there's essentially two main positions regarding the etiology or origin of dissociative identity disorder. The first perspective is the traumatogenic perspective. This model suggests that d.i.d. is a coping mechanism in response to overwhelming childhood trauma, most often coming in the form of chronic emotional, physical, or sexual abuse or neglect, although sexual abuse is by far the most common. In a majority of instances, it's thought that individuals with d.i.d. experienced prolonged, persistent, severe trauma that occurs over an average of 10 years, typically starting before the age of 6. The current theory is that at that young age, children have not fully formed their metacognitive abilities, which is essentially your ability to think about your own thinking. So for example, if you're watching this video, you might have a thought like,
"This guy looks vaguely like Captain America, but before the super soldier serum."
Metacognition is realizing that you're thinking that thought, and then taking it a step further by wondering,
why would I think something so mean like that?
Metacognition doesn't develop until around the age of 3, so when young children go through severe trauma, it surpasses their developmental capacity to cope. And so when triggers related to the trauma come up, it's believed that the mind employs dissociation as a defense mechanism in order to detach, compartmentalize, and protect itself from fully reliving the traumatic experience. And it does this by constructing distinct identities that, in theory, give the child some mental distance from the overwhelming distress. After all, it's a whole lot easier to manage trauma if it didn't actually happen to you, but instead happened to someone else. In contrast to this traumatogenic explanation, there is the iatrogenic model. This model suggests that d.i.d. is not caused by trauma, but rather by therapists and popular media. The theory behind this model is that patients who are diagnosed with d.i.d. do show to be highly hypnotizable, fantasy-prone, and suggestible individuals. And so when they go to see a therapist who believes in things like multiple personalities or repressed memories, those ideas become implanted and the patient essentially plays the role of someone who has d.i.d. after it's been imposed on them. This can also happen simply due to social influences, such as being exposed to discussions of dissociative identity disorder in movies or on social media, which would naturally flow into a discussion of TikTok, but I don't feel like we've earned that conversation quite yet, at least not without talking about a little bit of history. The historical roots of what we now identify as dissociative identity disorder date back to 1584, long before the dawn of modern psychology and psychotherapy. In a captivating account, Jean Ferry, a 25-year-old French nun, meticulously documented her own exorcism, which detailed symptoms that seemed to align perfectly with our contemporary understanding of d.i.d. She exhibited multiple alters capable of taking control over her body, including the persona of the religious figure Mary Magdalene. She experienced gaps in memory when switching between identities. She demonstrated disturbances in consciousness, emotions, and body functions. She engaged in self-harm, and she made numerous suicide attempts as well. And notably, she endured severe childhood abuse. It's a fascinating case, and it's also an example of how exorcisms were often used to treat many mental illnesses that, at the time, were viewed as possessions by demons. Jumping ahead to 1885, a French patient named Louis Vivet was the first person to be explicitly diagnosed with having multiple personalities. Louis had a rough life. He was raised by a single mother who worked as a prostitute, and he experienced regular beatings and often went hungry. That neglect and abuse triggered early attacks of hysteria, and by the tender age of 8, he'd already garnered a reputation as being a problematic child due to being a vagrant and a thief, which ultimately led him to be sentenced to correctional housing after he was caught stealing. He spent the next decade in corrections. At the age of 17, he was working in a vineyard in one of those correctional agricultural colonies when he was attacked by a viper that wound itself around his left arm. Understandably, it freaked him the out and traumatized him, and shortly thereafter, he lost consciousness, began to have violent convulsions, and became paralyzed from the waist down. Eventually, he was transferred to an asylum to be treated for epilepsy. But over the next year, Louis would again experience severe convulsions, and upon coming back to consciousness, would miraculously stand up, request his work clothes, and appear to have no memory of his paralysis or of ever being at the asylum. This physical change was accompanied by a drastic personality change. When he was paralyzed, he was a quiet, kind, intelligent young man. But when walking, he became arrogant, argumentative, and conniving. It's thought today that Louis had 3 distinct identities, and no matter how often he was told by those around him about these different identities, they never shared memories, and he couldn't recall what he did in his other states. There are numerous other case studies both before and after Louis Vivet that share similarities with what we now recognize as dissociative identity disorder. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to set aside those cases and delve into more modern history when the concept started to enter public consciousness. Which would bring us to 1954, when the psychological thriller The Bird's Nest was published by the acclaimed author Shirley Jackson. This fictional novel revolves around a young woman named Elizabeth Richmond who starts experiencing blackouts and losing chunks of time, during which an alternate personality named Liz takes over. In the book, she seeks out help from a psychiatrist, and it's revealed that she has multiple personalities, each with their own distinct characteristics, stemming from a traumatic childhood. It ends on a dark turn with one of Elizabeth's personalities attempting to harm herself. This novel was later turned into a film about 3 years later titled Lizzie. Around that same time, riding the wave of public fascination with multiple personalities that was sparked by The Bird's Nest, Two opportunistic psychiatrists persuaded Chris Cosner Sizemore, who was a patient of theirs, who was still under their care, to sign away the rights to her life story to 20th Century Fox. These psychiatrists believed that Sizemore had developed multiple personalities due to witnessing 2 deaths in an accident in her childhood. In just a year, they wrote both a book and a screenplay, and in 1957, the best-selling novel and the Oscar-winning film, The 3 Faces of Eve, were released. The book and film follow the life of a seemingly ordinary housewife, Eve White, who starts experiencing blackouts and losing chunks of time. She seeks out help from a psychiatrist, and it's revealed that she has multiple personalities, each with their own distinct characteristics, stemming from a traumatic childhood experience. But this one has a happy ending, with the 3 personalities becoming one through the use of hypnosis, and she lived happily ever after. Needless to say, the concept of multiple personalities was in the air, but public fascination is very different from institutional acceptance. In 1968, the second edition of the DSM was published, and d.i.d. doesn't make an appearance because it hadn't been identified as a distinct diagnosis. Instead, the DSM featured a diagnosis called hysterical neurosis dissociative type. The description of the condition reads, "In the dissociative type, alterations may occur in the patient's state of consciousness or in his identity to produce such symptoms as amnesia, somnambulism, fugue, and multiple personality." So yeah, that's a pretty unspecific diagnosis covering a lot of different forms of dissociation. It might not look anything like d.i.d. today, but you can see the glimmer of recognition in there. However, only 5 short years later, things started to get really wild. In 1973, the nonfiction book Sybil hits the shelves and becomes a sensation overnight, selling 6 million copies within a 4-year span and inspiring an award-winning TV movie that was seen by 1/5 of all Americans. Its tagline tells you exactly what to expect: the true story of a woman possessed by 16 separate personalities. It follows the therapeutic journey of Sybil Dorsett, which is a pseudonym used to protect the real identity of Shirley Ardell Mason. The book chronicles the psychiatric treatment that she received from Dr. Cornelia Wilbur, which uncovered repressed memories from her childhood, explored her present-day struggles, and detailed the process of integrating her multiple personalities into a unified sense of self. Prior to the release of Sybil, there had been fewer than 100 documented cases of people with multiple personalities, but in the 20 years following Sybil, there were over 40,000 reported cases of people claiming to also suffer from multiple personalities. Some might argue that Sybil's case, her story, gave language to their own similar experiences and allowed them to seek treatment. Others might say that Sybil kicked off a multiple personality epidemic that led many impressionable people to believe that they suffered the same problem. Many believe that the d.i.d. symptoms that Shirley Ardell Mason experienced herself were induced by the psychiatrist Dr. Wilbur. And honestly, there are some legit concerns surrounding Dr. Wilbur's practices. I could do a whole video on Sybil, honestly, but just to give you a taste of these issues, Dr. Wilbur frequently injected Mason with sodium pentothal, a barbiturate that was once experimented with as a truth serum. And it got to the point that Mason actually developed a physical addiction to the drug. Adding to the list of concerns, Sybil was written while Mason was still under Dr. Wilbur's care. Dr. Wilbur would often try to sell paintings that Mason had done in order to financially help her out, and she even offered to help Mason get into medical school and cover both her tuition and living expenses. This enmeshment continued for pretty much the rest of their lives. Mason actually moved into Dr. Wilbur's home to act as her caretaker at the end of her life after she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. According to reports, Dr. Wilbur was the first to tell Mason that she had an interest in multiple personalities, before Mason ever revealed symptoms that aligned with that diagnosis. And maybe it's just a coincidence, but Mason started seeing Dr. Wilbur in 1954, the same year that The Bird's Nest was released. These intertwining dynamics raise some serious ethical questions, and, at least for me, make the case of Sybil essentially useless for understanding d.i.d. Nevertheless, it's undeniable that Sybil left a significant mark. This pop phenomenon stirred so much commotion in the psychotherapy world that when the DSM-3 was published in 1980, it played a pivotal role in the formal inclusion of multiple personality disorder as a recognized diagnosis. And that term, multiple personality disorder, it still gets thrown out a lot, even though the release of the 4th edition of the DSM only 14 years later changed it to what it is today, Dissociative Identity Disorder. And that name change is important. As I talked about earlier in the video, it redirects the focus of the disorder from the notion of having multiple personalities instead to the challenge of, integrating these identities into a single personality. And ever since the DSM-4, the diagnosis hasn't really changed all that much, outside of including memory gaps as a criteria. Given this complex history, it's no wonder that d.i.d. has been the source of controversy. On the one hand, there are case studies that predate the diagnosis, which gives credence to the traumatogenic model and validates d.i.d. as legitimate. And recent research consistently presents compelling evidence. Individuals with d.i.d. share a common history of childhood trauma, exhibit similar symptoms, and even show discernible differences in their brain functioning when switching between alters, as shown by brain imaging technology. On the other hand, when d.i.d. appears in popular media, there's a sudden surge in both reported cases and research attention, only to see it drop back down later on. Likewise, most d.i.d. diagnoses are made in North America, and research shows that d.i.d. patients are, in fact, much more suggestible compared to the average person, and even compared to other mental illnesses. This kind of pattern isn't typical for other mental health diagnoses, which seems to align more with the iatrogenic model. Sybil was the start of one of these bumps, which continued for about 20 years. The combination of the changes to d.i.d. in the DSM-4 and the satanic panic of the 1980s and early 90s contributed to the sensationalization of multiple personality disorder. Suddenly, the public was consumed by fear about alleged satanic ritual child abuse committed by evil cults. This frenzy triggered false memories in people of ritual child abuse. And it even led to false accusations of daycare providers who literally went to jail because of this mass hysteria. But by the mid-90s, the satanic panic waned, and the rates of multiple personality disorder sharply declined. The aftermath spawned several psychiatric malpractice lawsuits. For example, there were several against a psychiatrist named Dr. Bennett Braun, who worked at Rush Hospital here in Chicago in the 80s. Dr. Braun supposedly specialized in multiple personality disorder, but stories from his patients indicate that he induced the disorder and further deteriorated their mental health. For example, Patricia Burgess, your average Illinois mom, sought treatment for postpartum depression with Dr. Braun, but later developed 300 separate personalities under his care, which involved hypnosis, drugging, and suggestive techniques. She also came to believe that her parents were cannibals, that she had abused her 2 young children, and that she'd had sex with JFK. The lawsuit was settled in 1993 for $10.6 million. Since that craze, dissociative identity disorder has never really gone out of style in popular media. Films like Fight Club, Me, Myself, and Irene, and Split, as well as TV shows like Mr. Robot, United States of Terra, and more recently Moon Knight, have used d.i.d. as comedic or dramatic plot devices. Even I dabbled in it when I first started learning how to edit videos. One of the first short films I ever made involved someone accidentally learning about d.i.d. while reading chess strategy books. and then played against an altar while a mashup of Toxic and Yeah blasted in the background. I was a teenager, I don't know. And while I appreciate well-written stories with interesting premises, excluding my own film, it's worth noting that most of these portrayals are inaccurate and often rely on negative stereotypes rather than aiming for a factual representation. I have mixed feelings about that because, on one hand, these are works of fiction and creators often take liberties to enhance a story. On the other hand, misrepresentations can contribute to stigmatization and shaming of people with the disorder. But I'm not going to get into it any further, so you all can fight about it in the comments. The reality is that dissociative identity disorder is not a flashy, exciting, or dangerous condition. It's also not a fun, quirky character trait. If you believe the traumatogenic model, d.i.d. isn't a choice, but rather the only way that your mind could cope with horrific, unbearable trauma. It's serious, difficult, and upsetting. Dissociative episodes are terrifying. There's really no evidence that individuals with d.i.d. are violent, or cunning con artists, or anarchists capable of bombing an entire city skyline.
Trust me, everything's gonna be fine.
Instead, these individuals often struggle with daily life, keep to themselves, and prioritize their own self-preservation and safety, both physically and mentally. At least that was the general clinical consensus until TikTok came into play. Recently, there's been a surge in the number of self-diagnoses of dissociative identity disorder, particularly among kids who are between the ages of 11 and 17, who say they discovered the diagnosis by watching TikTok. Now, at this point, we could all just do the thing where we bash TikTok because that's what you're supposed to do. How dare these youths try to understand their own messed up minds? But listen, we all do this. We all go to WebMD or that one friend or whatever to rule out that the pain in our right ankle isn't cancer. But self-diagnosis, nonetheless, does bring up questions about the accuracy and legitimacy of d.i.d. among so many of these people. On the one hand, it's possible that social media sites like TikTok are giving people with genuine d.i.d. diagnoses a way to connect and share their common experiences. It's also very possible that the trendiness of d.i.d. on TikTok has led to an increase in the number of people claiming to have d.i.d. who are either mistaken, confused, or simply faking it. And it wouldn't be the first time that TikTok has induced widespread medical issues. Back in 2021, there was a phenomenon known as TikTok tics, in which young people were developing Tourette syndrome-like tics at an alarming rate. It's also been credited with increasing the number of inaccurate ADHD self-diagnoses. And so, medical professionals and armchair psychologists who think that this is all just a fad point to the exaggerated displays of switching, the glamorization of alters, and the boasting about having d.i.d., and say that these people are simply imitating pop culture representations of the diagnosis because it doesn't align with the typical clinical presentation. For example, switching most often happens in response to stress and triggers of trauma, not on command as you might find on TikTok. Alters tend to be subtle in presentation in most cases, and people with d.i.d. are often covert with their diagnosis, an attempt to hide that part of themselves to keep themselves safe. Not so on TikTok.
I don't know, how do we switch so quickly? Oh, we almost glitched. Yeah, I felt that.
However, the members and supporters of d.i.d. TikTok might tell you that very few are faking it, or at least no more than you might find on social media in general. Rather, because TikTok provides a safe haven and a community space for people with d.i.d. who have historically felt isolated and like they needed to keep their issues under wraps, it allows for more expressive, creative, outward-facing displays of d.i.d. that, don't match clinical presentation. I mean, after all, how you present yourself online can be very different from how you are in your everyday life. I mean, in my life, I can hardly string 2 sentences together, but you only see a polished presentation. So, in other words, while the videos on TikTok may not be the typical clinical presentation, it's not meant to be. It's entertainment, not reality. In my personal opinion, the rise of d.i.d. diagnoses is a mix of these 2 factors. Even as far back as Sybil, I think popular media increases the visibility of the symptoms associated with d.i.d. and then leads to more people getting help who genuinely struggle with the issue. Having a resource of information about d.i.d. on a platform that kids actually use could significantly raise awareness, and therefore, it's important and valuable. A lot of these people who self-diagnose likely have a similar story. They feel like things in their mind aren't right. They don't have the ability to seek a professional diagnosis, and so they find labels and communities that seem to match their experiences. But I also think there are many cases of misdiagnosis and people imitating the disorder due to that social influence. Not everyone on TikTok is being honest or accurate about having d.i.d. And I know this for certain because I've seen confessions by TikTok creators and YouTubers and regular folks on Reddit who admit to faking d.i.d. for attention or who realize that they were mistaken. But it's worth acknowledging that even in most of these cases, these people are still struggling with an aspect of their mental health, just not d.i.d. But even though that does happen, even if there were more people who falsely believe that they have d.i.d. than people who actually have it, that doesn't give anyone permission to go onto TikTok and start fake claiming. I certainly can't diagnose someone or tell what's legit or not based on a 3-minute video, and I don't think it's particularly productive to try to invalidate others in general. We don't know their lives, so please don't bother these people. Now, some people might wonder, what do you care? You know, what's the problem with having some people think that they have d.i.d.? They're not hurting anyone. But that might actually not be true. To argue in the opposite direction, misdiagnosis can be a big issue because on an individual level, it can lead to ineffective or even harmful treatment. And on a broader scale, in situations where dissociative identity disorder is imitated or portrayed as a mere personality quirk, it spreads misinformation and contributes to sensationalism on social media, which delegitimizes d.i.d. and makes people less likely to take it seriously. So the risk is that the fad element further marginalizes folks who are actually living with d.i.d. while doing a disservice to the people who think that they have d.i.d. but might have another disorder who are not being properly treated. I know I've primarily focused on TikTok, but YouTube plays a role in this too, though to a slightly different audience. It really shows the power that these platforms have, particularly in shaping public perception. Algorithms can end up having this outsized impact on what gets fed to us. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where like you watch one video on, I don't know, how to fix a leaky sink. And then coincidentally, you get recommended 10 more videos about remodeling your whole bathroom. And then at some point, your whole homepage is filled with the same stuff, and it feels hard to get outside of that media bubble that you accidentally fell into. So if you, like me, have been looking for something different and a way to break out of that machine-fed dumpster fire, then I think you should check out my streaming platform, Nebula. The whole point of Nebula is to give creators like me a space to experiment and explore without worrying about algorithms or being demonetized. It's chock full of exclusive videos from FD Signifier, Not Just Bikes, Lindsay Ellis, and tons of others, including me, like this video where I react to TikTok therapy memes, funny enough.
She was so desperate for this one moment, and I swear I got her little hopes up. Like, she just has wanted me to be vulnerable for so long, and I feel bad for her.
I would be lying if I said that there wasn't some joy that comes from seeing a person just open up and be vulnerable. I feel like that happens to a lot of people where they have that block, right? It's just like, you can't quite get there, can't quite get open. That's fine, you know, we all gotta deal with our own stuff in our own way. Depends on if you want that or not. Maybe I should have done some d.i.d. memes. Oh well. Nebula is owned and operated by the creators themselves, which means that when you subscribe and watch my videos, the money made from that goes directly to me. So it's a really great way to support the channel. Plus, there's so much more that makes it a no-brainer, including a bunch of videos that directly relate to what we've been talking about with d.i.d, including Be Kind Rewind's video that dives deep into the true tale behind the 3 Faces of Eve, CinemaWin's video exploring everything great about Split, Georgia Dow's Therapist React videos on Moon Knight, or Arnita Sarkeesian's Nebula exclusive about the Satanic Panic. Plus, you can watch all my videos before they get uploaded to YouTube ad-free. I really can't say enough about how thankful I am to all of my current Nebula subscribers. It's an awesome community, and I can't recommend it enough. So, if you're into ad-free, extended, or exclusive videos that we don't put up anywhere else, plus experimental, bigger budget, and more exciting videos from many of the best creators out there, then sign up using the link below. That'll support me directly, and you get 40% off the annual plan, which is as little as $2.50 a month. Just go to nebula.tv/neurotransmissions to support the channel and check out all of our videos right now. Thanks, y'all. But I want to shift gears to talk about the second controversy related to d.i.d, which is somewhat related. Oh, you thought we were done? No. Let me set the scene with a personal story. When I was in graduate school to become a therapist, it was right before the DSM-5 was to be released. And we talked a lot about what was coming down the pike. There's a lot of focus put on preparing and getting ready for the coming changes. And at the time, I can recall a few of my professors predicting that dissociative identity disorder would be drastically changed or removed altogether from the DSM. You see, in addition to the debate about whether dissociative identity disorder is caused by trauma or if it's caused by social influences coming from media or mental health professionals, the other debate is about whether dissociative identity disorder is a valid psychiatric disorder at all. And the argument being made is that the symptoms can be better explained by other conditions. I'm going to be very upfront and say that I tend this direction. One reason for that is that I've never personally seen a single case of d.i.d. in over a decade of practice. And as far as I'm aware, my colleagues have never diagnosed anyone with d.i.d. And this is despite working with populations who experience a lot of trauma, especially childhood trauma. This has included people with addictions, people with severe mental illnesses who are unhoused or who are chronically incarcerated, as well as children who fled their homes to seek asylum in the United States. Trauma is one of my specialties. So you'd think that I would have run into it by now, because I've certainly run into many other disorders that, at least according to population statistics, are far more rare. That said, I'm just one dude, and my anecdotal data means very little. But beyond my own personal experience, there is data that shows high comorbidity or overlap with other mental health diagnoses. For example, depending on the research that you look at, it's estimated that anywhere from 80 to 100% of individuals diagnosed with d.i.d. also meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. 64 to 70% meet criteria for borderline personality disorder. To me, that's an amazing degree of overlap, particularly with PTSD, and particularly with borderline personality disorder, considering it's no more common than d.i.d. Borderline personality disorder shares many of the same traits, including mood swings, identity diffusion, a lack of a stable identity over time, dissociation, difficulty with self-image, and the suspected cause being a history of childhood trauma. The main difference seems to be amnesia, since that's not a specified marker of borderline personality disorder, though many people with BPD report gaps in memory while dissociating. And if you look at the common symptoms of PTSD, derealization, depersonalization, mood swings, intrusive memories, avoidance, amnesia, impaired functioning, what that leaves unaddressed is the disrupted identity marked by 2 or more distinct personality states. But imagine, if you will, that you're a mental health professional and you start working with a veteran. And this veteran shares stories of experiencing intense stress and triggers of traumatic memories that lead them to black out. But then later on, they're informed that during these episodes, they were shouting orders and reaching for a radio and behaving erratically. In that scenario, you probably wouldn't call this d.i.d. and say that they switched to their soldier alter. Instead, you diagnose them with PTSD with dissociative symptoms. If you look at the criteria of the diagnosis, the wording is fairly subjective and broad. What constitutes a distinct identity state? How is that determined? People often use turn of phrases like, I don't feel like myself, or I was acting like a different person, or people can feel outside of their bodies or like they're a passenger in their own life due to derealization and depersonalization. Is that what we're talking about? Memory is also a subjective experience. I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, or I might experience highway hypnosis and wonder how I got to my destination, or I might feel so dissociated that I'm not fully aware of my actions, even to the point of blacking out. There's a lot of wiggle room for interpretation, and we see a considerable range in experiences among the people living with d.i.d. Of course, there's a great deal of subjectivity and broadness in many psychological diagnoses, but to illustrate what I mean, compare it to other diagnostic criteria, like mania in bipolar disorder. d.i.d, as it stands right now, lacks specificity. Now, there are totally reasonable counterarguments to everything that I'm saying. For example, it could be that therapists, such as myself, are actually the ones misdiagnosing due to not being able to recognize the subtle symptoms of dissociative identity disorder. It's often claimed by d.i.d. proponents that people in the mental health profession don't receive enough training and education around dissociative disorders in general. And that further leads to significantly less research attention being put toward dissociative disorders, which explains the lack of specificity and the open questions. Also, the therapies designed to treat d.i.d, which often focus on fusing the various identities back into one cohesive whole, do seem to work. I don't want to give the impression that this is so obvious, because it really is complex. But, in my professional opinion, for whatever that's worth, I believe that dissociative identity disorder should not be a distinct, standalone diagnosis, but rather a new subtype of other disorders. That might sound a little bit like splitting hairs, but if it were up to me, I would recommend reclassifying d.i.d. as post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative identity type, and borderline personality disorder with dissociative amnesia. There's a saying that goes, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This proposal that I'm putting forward, it's almost certainly wrong. But I believe that it would be more useful than the current diagnosis of d.i.d. Why is this important? And why should you care? Well, as much as we might bristle against the idea of being put into a box, categorizing mental illnesses can make them easier to understand, easier to treat, and easier to share information if we're speaking the same theoretical language. People with dissociative identity disorder might significantly benefit from the diagnosis being recategorized, because it would help mental health professionals tailor treatments that are based on its common characteristics and etiology with other disorders. Almost certainly, the amount of research would likely increase into it because it would have a more well-established theoretical foundation. And it would also further reduce the stigma and misunderstanding that circled this condition since its inception. So those are my thoughts. If it wasn't obvious from the start, I want to be 100% clear that outside of the non-genuine cases, the people diagnosed with d.i.d. are experiencing symptoms of d.i.d. Whether it belongs under another diagnosis or not is mostly a semantic argument. There might be some folks in the comments who think that I'm contributing to the problem and further stigmatizing d.i.d. Know that that's not my intention, and your lived experiences are valid. In any case, Thanks for listening to me ramble. I'd be curious to hear your own thoughts in the comments, particularly from those of you who are currently diagnosed with d.i.d. And until next time, I'm Micah. Think about it.